Welcome back to Romans Part 2. I am Paul Olson, and we are just about ready to jump into chapter 12. The summary statement is first steps in how to live in this new family. Our key verse is verses 1 and 2. And our summary is this: as worship to God, consider yourselves a living sacrifice. Do not be duplicit to others, but be changed by rethinking all that you have learned, so that you may know God's will concerning all that is good, acceptable, and perfect. Do not think you are better than anyone else, because we all belong to one body with Christ, and everyone has their own function, like parts of a body. Some excel at prophecy, some with serving, some with teaching, some with encouraging, some with giving, some with leading, and some with being merciful. Let all your love and actions be pure and sincere. Love and honor each other as family members, passionately serving the Lord. Hope with joy, long suffer through trials, and always praying. Meet the needs of others. Bless and serve your enemies. Stand with those in good and bad times. Live peaceably without conceit or self-interest. Do not seek revenge, but always repay evil with good. Now, congratulations. You've made it. We are at the top, the pinnacle, the peak of Romans. It's all downhill from here. Everything that we've learned so far has prepared us for the next few chapters. Paul has equipped us for what lies ahead. So what lies ahead? How the gospel gets lived out in our lives, with others and with the world. As a whole, Romans 12 through 15:13 is Paul's instructions and exhortations in how to live out the implications of the gospel, which he has presented already in chapters 1 through 11. This is the gospel. This is who we are. That was 1 to 11. Now, this is how we are to live with others in the world. That's chapters 12 to 15:13. This transformed living in verse 2 is foundational for all that follows to 15:13. The content in chapters 1 to 11, the content is the form. Now, can we cut? Sure. Content is okay.
Yeah, you want to take it back maybe like
congratulations.
A couple sentences. You don't have to maybe go back that far.
Okay. Okay, as a whole, Romans 12. How about right there? Oh, you don't have my notes, do you? Okay, I'm going to go back just a couple sentences where I had a break. As a whole, Romans 12 through 15, verse 13, is Paul's instructions and exhortations on how to live out the implications of the gospel, which he presented in chapters 1 to 11. In chapters 1 to 11, we had, this is the gospel, and this is who you are. And now, in chapters 12 to 15, verse 13, this is how we are to live with others and the world. This transformed living in verse 2 is foundation for all that Paul talks about through chapter 15, verse 13. The content was in chapters 1 to 11, and the form is found in chapters 12 to 16. So, in verses 1 to 2, I appeal to you, therefore, brothers, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. Do not be conformed to the world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good, acceptable, and perfect. J.B. Phillips has an outstanding and memorable translation of those two verses. He says, with eyes wide open to the mercies of God, I beg you, my brothers, as an act of intelligent worship, to give him your bodies as a living sacrifice consecrated to him and acceptable by him. Don't let the world around you squeeze you into its mold, but let God remold your minds from within, so that you may prove and practice that the plan of God for you is good. It meets all his demands and it moves toward the goal of true maturity. In lieu of what Paul has said to this point, he implores us to true and proper worship, the presenting of our bodies as a living sacrifice. But that requires a couple things. First, not conforming or assimilating to this world. Second, being radically transformed through the renewing of our minds, allowing us to discern the things of God, specifically the good, the acceptable, and the perfect. But what are the mercies he talks about? Think back to what we've seen. Justification, adoption, under grace and not law, the giving of the Holy Spirit, perseverance through suffering, the assurance of God's election, God's righteousness, his covenant faithfulness, the coming glorification, and the promise of never being separated from God's love. And those are just the big ones. Verse 1 is the direct opposite of how Paul described the rebellion of creation in chapter 1, verses 18 to 32. You know, one old pastor said that the problem with a living sacrifice is that it wants to pick itself up off the altar and walk away. A living sacrifice is a paradox. It's an oxymoron. But this is our condition until Christ returns, just like what we saw in chapter 7. In verse 3, for by the grace given to me, I say to everyone among you not to think of himself more highly than he ought to think, but to think with sober judgment, each according to the measure of faith that God has assigned. In verses 3 to 8, we are not to think too highly of ourselves because we are one body, and each body or each member has a gift that is to be exercised. Those gifts include prophecy, hospitality, teaching, encouragement, generosity, leading, and compassion. Why should they be implemented and used? Because of love. Love for each other and for our enemies. That's verses 9 to 21. You know, for the most part, up to this point, verses 1 to 8 has dealt more with internal matters of transformed and renewed living. The remaining verses, though, and then all the way to chapter 15, all deal with external matters of transformed, renewed living and how we relate to others and the world. Verse 9, let love be genuine, abhor what is evil, hold fast to what is good. That's also a parallel to verse 21, and it sets the tone for the rest of the chapter. Brotherly affection, outdoing one another and showing honor, not being slothful, fervent in spirit, serving the Lord, rejoicing in hope, patient in tribulation, constant in prayer, and meeting the needs of others are all evidences of this transformed living under the banner of love. Verses 14 to 21 gives more instructions, but it is directed to conduct in response to those who may be at odds with us, specifically our enemies. Bless those who persecute you and do not curse them. Live in harmony with everyone. Do not be haughty. Associate with the lowly. Do not be wise in your own might. That's repeated from verse 8. Do not repay evil with evil. That's a parallel to verse 9 and verse 21. Do what is honorable in the sight of all. Live peacefully. Never avenge for yourself. Feed your hungry enemy and give your thirsty enemy something to drink. Does any of this sound familiar? It should, because much of the material in chapters 12 to 13 echoes Jesus' very words from the Sermon on the Mount, not least these current verses 9 to 21. Verse 20b, for by doing so, you will heap burning coals on his head. That's probably referring to an ancient Egyptian custom where someone demonstrated public contrition by carrying a pan of burning coals on their head, which was a symbolic physical representation of their burning shame and guilt. so that when the Christian helps their enemy, it should provoke shame for their animosity and the dislike of the generous Christian. That's what Paul's getting at. Verse 21, do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. Verse 21 is a general rewording of what he said in verse 2. Paul ends this chapter how he began it. The do not be conformed in verse 2 is the do not be overcome by evil in verse 21. And the be transformed by the renewing of your mind, may discern what is the will of God, what's good, acceptable, perfect. That is the overcoming the evil with good in verse 21. The transformed, renewed mind allows discernment of both good and evil and facilitates the overcoming of evil with good. Verse 20 and 21 serve then as bookends to this chapter, prefaced by the presenting of our bodies as a living sacrifice. Now, what started at verse 9 with genuine love grasping onto the good and hating evil, which is Paul's multidimensional aspects of love, comes back to where it began. Do not let evil overtake you and have victory, but overtake and have victory over evil with good. Now, this verse has a few implications. The two verbs in this verse are not suggestions, but commands. They're imperatives. Even more, they are present imperatives. The first, do not be overcome by evil, is a present imperative with a negative, which calls for the stopping of something already going on. Therefore, stop being overcome by evil. And the second, overcome evil with good, also being a present imperative, is calling for something to keep on occurring. Therefore, overcome, conquer, subdue, defeat evil with good, repeat. It appears that all the exhortations in verses 9 through 20 are leading to verse 21. Those qualities and conduct expedites the capability to respond to our enemies with such fashion in 20 and 21. Instead of seeking vengeance on our own terms, deserve it or not, we are to meet the needs of our enemies. This is more than what he said in verse 14 about blessing those who persecute, and even Jesus' words about praying for your enemies in Matthew 5. And the prohibition of repaying evil for evil is first introduced in verse 17, but it is elaborated in verse 21. Verse 21 adds some more meaning to verse 14, and it elaborates verse 17. This is the point. The point is you will have enemies, and they will be evil to you. Genuine love determines what your response will be. Overcoming evil with good, or overcoming it, or trying to overcome it with evil. That is the choice. Overcome or be overcome. The struggle of good versus evil is presented by Paul to us not in terms of the existence of the enemy, Satan, but in how we treat our enemies. Overcoming evil requires action, not inaction or passivity. It requires goodness. Basically, everything that he's mentioned in verses 3 to 20. Being overcome by evil implies not only being overcome by evil done to you by others, but being overcome in the evil in one's own heart. Rabbi Jonathan Cahn once said, he's a believer, he said, you don't overcome darkness by focusing on the darkness. You overcome darkness by focusing on the light. And Charles Spurgeon said of this verse, the text appears to give us a choice between two things and bids us to choose the better one. You must either be overcome by evil or you must yourself overcome evil. One of the two. You cannot let evil alone, and evil will not let you alone. You must fight, and in the battle you must either conquer or be conquered. Verse 21 is significant for the next couple chapters. We're going to have submission to civic and government authorities, more on love, passing judgment, and causing others to stumble. So those will be the next topics that are coming up. But the means by which all this can be addressed and be done, including overcoming evil with good, along with all the exhortations that Paul has been saying in this chapter and in the coming chapters, are all prefaced by the presenting our bodies as living sacrifices through transformed living and renewed minds. Wow, that was a lot to chew on, considering what we just got done with chapters 9 to 11. Paul went hard in the paint, as they say. But fortunately for us, Paul's just getting started, because he has a lot more to say on how we live and how we conduct ourselves with what we now know. So read chapter 13, and we'll see what else constitutes this transformed living and renewed thinking.